I honestly think that they all come in with the best of intentions, but something happens on the way to the forum.
The key is, are they effective with the tools and the opportunities that they have in their own time?
Washington was not the brightest bulb on the block.
You like ice, I like ice.
He turned out, in retrospect, to be the perfect person for that time.
I had no knowledge whatever of the Watergate break-in.
They can always say no comment, but if they lie, it is so disillusioning.
I miss Nixon. I was sorry to see him go.
We want to see our president jogging. We want to see him out doing push-ups and running the marathon. Would we elect a man who rode in a wheelchair?
What counts is human life. And the presidents who protect us by keeping us out of war, by ending wars as speedily as possible while protecting the free system, those are great presidents. Those are great men. Someday there'll be great women among their midst, too.
We open with number 10, a towering Texan who built a great society out of a great tragedy.
I was on Simmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way toward the Trade Mart. It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
The President of the United States is dead.
He came into office with an awesome responsibility to calm a shattered nation. But Lyndon Baines Johnson was no ordinary leader. He was a master politician who pushed and prodded and never took no for an answer.
Lyndon Johnson could grab you around the shoulders and take you by one arm, and before you knew it, you had been charmed into giving him the family farm.
Good God, I'd rather hear your voice than hear Jesus this morning. How are you feeling? Well,
You listen to his manner on the phone with people and his way of appealing to them, and how's your wife, whose name he always knows, and all of that. And then he said, now I need these two more votes, and I'm just counting on you. And I was he had a great ability to persuade and to bring people over to his side.
How could you say no?
It was Johnson's political skill that made JFK's vision a reality, an amazingly ambitious social agenda. By the time LBJ was through, he had ramrodded through Congress a war on poverty, a Medicare plan, and above all, a series of sweeping civil rights bills. In the 1960s, only an ambitious Southerner could make that happen.
Kennedy never could have accomplished that because the South and much of the Midwest would have rallied against this Yankee trying to ram civil rights down the throats of the rest of the country.
LBJ's meteoric rise would be tempered by a war he didn't start and couldn't finish.
I think that a lot of people who lived through Vietnam would be surprised that he would be in the top 10.
It breaks my heart to think that Lyndon Johnson will forever be known by the Vietnam War. Not a war of his making, but a war of his continuance.
LBJ's role in the escalating Vietnam War made him so unpopular that in 1968 he had no choice but to make a startling decision, a decision that stunned the nation.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
LBJ was a president who always wanted to be loved, and he realized in 1968 that no one loved him anymore, and it broke his heart. Even though his social programs and his record of accomplishment in domestic affairs to this day is unparalleled.
And I think that when you look back now, and you see what he was trying to do domestically, the domestic agenda, the Great Society, the strides he was trying to make in terms of civil rights, was an extraordinary legacy.
Our number 9 led the free world to victory in World War II, and that was before his presidency even began. In the 50s, everyone liked Ike.
I would put him America's great presidents for 3 reasons. One, he had a great character, and he was considered a father and grandfather figure for the whole country. Two, he stood up to the communists repeatedly, while at the same time ending the war in Korea, and he allowed us to defend ourselves in the Cold War without ourselves becoming a militaristic state.
You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
Dwight D. Eisenhower swept into office in 1952, a war hero determined to end wars and stop communist expansion, starting at Korea's 38th parallel.
We knew we were in the hands of an adult, because he had, in fact, beaten the crap out of the Germans. So we knew that, if there's anyone going to take care of the Russians, it was going to be Dad.
From Korea to Berlin, Father knew best. But here at home, he had his hands full. In 1957, an uproar began when 9 black teenagers tried to enroll at the all-white Little Rock Central High School. School desegregation had been the law since 1954's monumental Brown versus the Board of Education. Now the commander-in-chief had to enforce it.
And here I think his real greatness shines. He obeyed the will of the Supreme Court, and in a deliberate, careful way, he went about desegregating America's schools. I think some would say he did it much too slowly, but he did it.
In the end, some teased that Eisenhower was more interested in golf than the presidency, but he was in tune with his time and steered America through the key challenges of the 50s.
Eisenhower was a good president for the time. It was a time when most Americans wanted to basically go home from the war, get fat, get rich.
I remember that when he left office, he was considered a failure. And then sometime 10 years later, it started to shift, and people began to say, well, 8 years of peace, not bad. And 8 years of that economic growth, terrific. And his reputation shot up.
Number 8 was a college professor with a dream, an idealistic vision of world government that was decades ahead of his time. Elected to office in 1913, Woodrow Wilson battled to improve working conditions and give women the right to vote. But it was World War I, a war he had tried to avoid, that would mark his place in history. When Germany tried to convince Mexico to attack the U.S. in 1917, Wilson went on the offensive. His pledge? To make the world safe for democracy. The Allied victory was stunning, but nearly 10 million lay dead. In the aftermath, President Wilson was inspired to create an organization that might end wars, a League of Nations. He sailed to Europe with a bold new plan.
It was a remarkable thing to call the nations of the world together and convince them that this was a body in which they could freely express themselves and solve problems. And as the precursor to the United Nations.
Wilson convinced the world at Versailles, but Congress was a harder sell. The president tried to rally support for his league, but the United States never did join.
Even though he really didn't accomplish as much as he thought in international affairs, he really laid a pattern that said America should provide leadership in this arena.
Wilson's vision of world peace would not be fully appreciated until more than 30 years later, after World War II, when the United Nations was finally formed. He never lived to see it. The flip side of our top 10 is the bottom 5, the worst presidents, like Warren G. Harding, a man who died in office and no one cared.
Worst president? I would say probably Warren Harding. Nothing good happened under him.
The nation's 29th president wasn't such a bad man. He just didn't stand for anything, except a few bad friends, political kingmakers who set him up to be exploited.
His friends were really able to take advantage of their now official positions, so that you have the Teapot Dome scandal, where one of Harding's friends basically makes money out of leasing oil lands.
Harding spent most of his time in the Oval Office playing poker and drinking. And when he wasn't chasing golf balls, he was chasing skirts. It was posthumously revealed that he used the White House to father an illegitimate child.
What's clear is that dalliances in the Oval Office didn't start with Bill Clinton. And Warren G. Harding's illegitimate daughter was once brought to the White House and shown the spot where Harding would meet her, with her mother in the back rooms of the Oval Office.
From the worst to the best, orphaned at the age of 14, our number 7 was a brand new kind of president, not an aristocrat, a frontiersman.
He was the first president born west of the Appalachian Mountains. While most presidents were formerly from either Virginia or Massachusetts, he was a Tennessean.
He was, like Washington, one of the first great war hero presidents, the shining knight on the white horse, a great military leader who could also lead the country.
Firebrand, Indian fighter, popular hero, Andrew Jackson entered the American Revolution at 13, later became a general in the War of 1812. For most of his life, he carried a bullet in his chest from a duel.
Jackson was orphaned during the Revolutionary War. He had nobody to sponsor him. He didn't have any money. Anything that Jackson accomplished was going to be by his own efforts.
By 1828, the population had risen from 4 million to 12 million, and the feisty general proved an attractive candidate to a nation of pioneers.
That was the time when America was a young country, when the wild, wild West was being born. It may have not been all the way out into the present-day Western states, but the West was Indiana and Ohio and Tennessee and Kentucky.
Jackson declared the White House should be open to the entire nation, and on Inauguration Day, 1829, it seemed as if the entire nation showed up.
There was this wild, rambunctious scene of these backwoodsmen who were his loyalists. They came to the White House in their muddy boots and trampled over the punch bowls and tipped over the furniture.
When the parties ended, Jackson's presidential battles began. The biggest took place when South Carolina threatened to leave the Union. The fiery president would hear none of it.
He believed in the Union. He said that if a state could leave the Union, then the Constitution was no more than a rope of sand.
But Jackson's Union had no place for its original inhabitants, the Native Indians.
He was a man of the people, unless you count Indians as people. So if you subtract Native Americans from human beings, then he was a man of the people.
History remembers it as the Trail of Tears. Jackson forcibly marched the Indians west to Oklahoma, and 1/4 of them died along the way. But before they left, they took their case to court.
The Cherokees appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, in a decision written by John Marshall, agreed with the Cherokees that they were legally entitled to stay on their present-day lands in Georgia.
Jackson had his own ideas of what the law was and what the Constitution said, and if the Supreme Court disagreed with him, he was alleged to have said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it.
And he was the only sitting president ever to ignore a decision of the Supreme Court.
Loved by some, hated by others, Andrew Jackson's legacy is that any American could reach the White House, even our number 6. No one thought he had a chance to be elected. No one expected much from him at all. But Harry S. Truman surprised just about everyone.
The Truman Doctrine, brilliant. Marshall Plan, great. Dropping the bomb, I agree, totally agree with. Korea did the right thing.
Truman had been vice president for just 82 days when he was urgently summoned to the White House. The news, FDR was dead. "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now," he told the press. Sworn in on April 12, 1945, this former Missouri farmer faced a relentless foe in the Pacific.
There's no way to believe that the Japanese were going to surrender. They hadn't surrendered at Okinawa, and they had inflicted on the American army a terrible, terrible wound.
The war with Japan looked ready to drag on for another year and a half, costing up to 1 million American casualties.
If the Japanese insist on continuing resistance, beyond the point of reason, their country will suffer the same destruction as Germany.
Truman offered Japan a final opportunity to surrender. They declined, and the earth shook.
Truman did a very brave thing by using the atom bomb. I mean, I think the atom bomb saved millions, literally millions of American and Japanese lives.
2 atomic bombs horrified many, but they ended the Second World War.
I was in the Army at the time, and I can remember when we heard about the bomb being dropped, our only reaction may not have been the most honorable reaction with regard to the Japanese, but our only reaction was, yippee, maybe we won't have to go out there and get killed.
One war over, Truman turned his sights to the battlefields of the future with the creation of the Truman Doctrine.
The Truman Doctrine was a statement by President Truman that the United States would resist the expansion of communism overseas. This was unprecedented in American history. No American president had ever stated in advance that the United States was going to take these kinds of action.
In 1948, the president backed the biggest post-war project ever, $13 billion to reconstruct Europe, the Marshall Plan. And he had one more brave move on the home front.
Truman's willingness to desegregate the armed forces really is an important step, because I think the integration of the military really foreshadows and in some ways forces integration in America.
Truman's desegregation of the military could have cost him the 1948 election, but it didn't. Harry Ship Truman had the guts to make tough decisions, whether pollsters liked them or not. And that is what makes him great.
Boy, would I like to see another guy like Harry Truman.
He could have been one of the greatest presidents, but a legacy of lies places him on our worst list.
Most of the terrible things that happened in the Nixon White House with Nixon was Nixon's sense of, I'll get the son of a bitch before the son of a bitch gets me. And that was what led to Watergate.
On June 17, 1972, police arrested 5 men for breaking into the Democratic Party's national headquarters at the Watergate apartment complex. During the next 2 years, the U.S. became polarized as the break-in was tied to Richard Nixon's White House.
That I had no knowledge whatever of the Watergate break-in.
I think he could have gotten through the Watergate scandal if he'd told the truth right away, if he'd gotten out ahead of it, as presidents have now learned to do.
For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap.
Through the spring and summer of 1973, Senator Sam Ervin asked the burning question, what did the president know, and when did he know it? Nixon's house of cards began tumbling when White House aide Alexander Butterfield went before the Watergate Committee with a shocking disclosure.
They asked this set of questions that led to, so there was a taping system.
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
And every conversation would be on that.
That's correct.
And I was watching this and I went,
oh, great! He's gone! He's gone!
Nixon's tapes confirmed what everyone had suspected. He had known all about the Watergate cover-up.
Now, on the investigation, the Democratic break-in thing, we're back in the problem area because the FBI is not under control. This is a hunt tool that'll uncover a lot of skill. We just feel that this is very detrimental to have this thing going further.
Obstruction of justice, thwarting an FBI investigation. The president had 2 options: face impeachment or resign.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon was ushered into exile. Despite his sad bravado, the scandal had overshadowed remarkable foreign policy achievements, including breakthrough diplomacy with China.
Nixon could have been a pretty good president. He was, in some respects, a pretty good president, but undone by his fatal flaw. And his fatal flaw was paranoia.
Called a man of many masks, Richard Nixon earns a spot on our worst list because he taught a nation to distrust its own government.
Nixon's the first president in our history to be forced to resign. And that's a heavy burden to carry for your legacy.
Our fifth best president, the original Rough Rider, the hard-charging leader who turned America into a world power.
Teddy Roosevelt was a great man. He saw America's destiny as unlimited. He believed in the individual. In fact, his slogan was rugged individualism. He was unafraid of physical danger himself. He was a man who was opposed to unlimited power of big business, which was very brave for him as a Republican. I think he was a pretty fine president, extremely fine president, extremely fine.
It was an assassin's bullet that put Theodore Roosevelt in the White House at the age of 42, the nation's youngest chief executive ever.
And in comes this 42-year-old, forward-looking, resolutely modern young president, at the precise moment when we needed a president who was capable of becoming a world leader.
Teddy Roosevelt soon proved himself to be the first 20th century president in every way.
Teddy Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington, who was the sort of leader of African American communities at that time, to come to the White House.
Now, this was the first time that any black man had been given this kind of intimate invitation by a president. And a proliferation of headlines and abuse was so vituperative I couldn't repeat it on national television to this day.
African Americans saw this as an unbelievably important moment. For them, it was a symbol of possibility, a symbol of change.
Industry was changing too. Huge steel and oil companies were becoming monopolies, sometimes corrupt monopolies. Roosevelt, the champion of the little man, took them on and broke them up.
T.R. himself did not think there was anything wrong with monopolies. The only thing that he objected to was monopolies prospering in illegal fashion. They're welcome to prosper, but we must know how they're prospering.
When Teddy was done cutting down big business, he cut through the jungles of Panama. His goal, to construct a canal, a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific. When the notoriously corrupt government of Colombia reneged on a deal with Roosevelt, a furious T.R. said, "We may have to give a lesson to these jackrabbits."
T.R., as president, stepped in and put in a gunboat offshore to prevent Colombia landing troops to put down this rebellion. The Republic of Panama to this day owes its existence to T.R. and his gunboats.
Roosevelt was just as forceful in peacetime accomplishments. In 1905, he won a Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating an end to the Russo-Japanese War. And he created more than 200 million acres of national parks, including his biggest coup, Arizona's Grand Canyon. In the end, Roosevelt's philosophy was summed up in an encounter with artist John Singer Sargent. When the two met unexpectedly in a White House stairwell, the artist asked, when might be a convenient time to paint the president? Teddy responded, now. Moments come and go, he said. Here is the time. Seize it. Do your best. Teddy Roosevelt always grabbed life with both hands. Inventor, architect, philosopher, and statesman, our number 4 wasn't just president. He drew up the blueprint for an entire country.
Well, I mean, some of his contributions were very obvious. He wrote a very important document called the Declaration of Independence, one of the greatest documents of all time. He bought the Louisiana Purchase. I'm not sure what there was about it that was bad.
Thomas Jefferson's greatest contribution may have come before his presidency. On July 4th, 1776, when the Founding Fathers formally announced the birth of a nation, they did it using Jefferson's words, the Declaration of Independence.
He knew how to write better than anyone of his generation, so that the ideas which may have come from all different sources took hold in the popular imagination because of how he wrote it down.
The document summed up everything America stood for. All men are created equal. an ironic thought in a time of slavery.
How could a man write those things and believe those things and yet rely completely on a slave economy at his plantation at Monticello?
I think we misunderstand and we miss the flavor of the 18th century. If we take our value judgments, we look back and we say, he was a hypocrite. You can't look back and say, Jefferson, you should have known.
A quiet man, Jefferson knew 6 languages, but preferred to communicate with a pen. He would spend 10 hours a day writing to Congress instead of speaking to them.
Would Jefferson have been an effective president in the age of radio or television? I doubt it. The key is, are they effective with the tools and the opportunities that they have in their own time?
One great opportunity presented itself in 1803. Needing cash, Napoleon Bonaparte made a sudden decision to sell a huge tract of land from the Mississippi Valley to the Rocky Mountains for a mere $15 million. With one stroke of the pen, Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of America. Jefferson's legacy, that Louisiana Purchase, and the ideals of a nation, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It seems only fitting that Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day after he defined America and inspired a revolution. He was drunk on his inauguration, and things went downhill from there. Andrew Johnson, the first president to be impeached.
Andrew Johnson did not have the confidence and contacts that would make effective leadership possible. He was stubborn and inflexible in personality, and he was a real racist.
With Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson became president in the pivotal days just after the Civil War. This uncouth former tailor had no idea how to heal a shattered nation. As the debate raged over reconstructing the defeated South, Andrew Johnson and Congress battled nonstop.
He was facing a group of monomaniacal haters in the Congress, and they were determined to thwart his will. The radical Republicans just chewed him up and spit him out because they wanted a severe reconstruction.
The tension between Johnson and Congress came to a head when the president fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. The inflamed Congress seized on Stanton's dismissal as an excuse to impeach the president. Johnson's failure was more about politics than ethics, but his inability to work with his Congress made his own demise inevitable.
He faced a difficult crisis and made it far worse. I think that's why Andrew Johnson would be my candidate for the worst president.
Struck down by polio, he spent most of his adult life in a wheelchair. Yet our number 3 would guide the nation through 2 of its greatest crises.
He was a spiritual leader of the United States. He was, more than his legislation, more than any act, more than any speech, he created hope and comfort in a dark world. Millions of adults who were terrified and said, "We can make this happen, don't worry." And he made them feel better.
In 1933, 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. Banks had closed in 38 states. The nation was sinking deep into depression. And a new president stepped forward to give his first inaugural speech.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt offered something only great leaders can provide: hope, optimism to lift a weary nation.
To us who were poor in those days, to 1/3 of a nation that he described as ill-fed, ill-housed, ill-clothed, to us he was a saint.
In his first 100 days in office, FDR began to reinvent the government with a flood of new programs to get America back to work. It was a brand new deal.
We forget that the federal government as we know it, which has an impact on every aspect of our lives, Social Security, the FAA, the FTC, the FCC, None of that existed before Roosevelt.
Remarkably, this man who lifted America up never let the nation see that he himself was crippled. He had contracted polio at age 39. The disease might have ended his political career. Instead, it transformed him. He said, "If you had spent 2 years in bed trying to wiggle your toe, after that, anything would seem easy."
Franklin D. Roosevelt's infantile paralysis, where he couldn't walk, certainly made him a much more compassionate man.
And prepared him for the hard times, when the Great Depression was followed by an even more startling event.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Through the next 4 years, FDR led America in its battle against the Germans and the Japanese, turning the nation into an arsenal of democracy. By 1944, he had been elected an unprecedented 4 times. In the end, his popularity was so great, only death could remove him from office.
I think people rise to the occasion, but this guy rose to a couple of occasions, the Depression and the war. And I'm surprised he's number 3. I'm surprised he isn't number 1.
At number 2, the man who created the job, the one who set the standard for every other president to follow, George Washington.
Most people think Washington was great because he was the first, but I think Washington was great because if he hadn't been the particular kind of man he was, there never would have been a second.
Raised a Virginia farmer, Washington led a ragtag army in a grueling 6-year battle against the British.
His great contribution is the inspiration of his men. People were fiercely loyal to Washington. He says, "I can't offer you money, I can't offer you shoes, I can't, stay with me," and they do. He's incredibly charismatic as a leader of men.
When the war ended, he was seen as the only man who could hold together the loose band of states that was 18th century America. The colonists offered him a crown, but he turned it down. An elected presidency was enough.
He refused to become king. They wanted him to be King George, and he basically said, "We just replaced one King George, let's not have another."
Washington would have none of it. He said, "You can call me Mr. President."
Mr. President took the oath of office on April 30th, 1789, on the balcony of Manhattan's Federal Hall. Around the world, skeptical monarchies watched and waited, anticipating failure. Washington knew he was defining an infant democracy. Washington's genius was to understand his own flaws and surround himself with men who compensated for them.
Part of what Washington did was recognize that this fragile republic needed such great men to help provide leadership that he surrounded himself with a Jefferson, with a Hamilton. And as a result of that, he was able to make choices that I think protected and launched this new republic.
In the end, Washington's greatest triumph was simply to retire. Offered power for life, he declined and walked away after just 2 terms, ensuring that a fledgling democracy would last.
He could have been president forever, and he said no.
Franklin Pierce earns a spot on our worst list because he was more a puppet than a president.
He was easily manipulated by stronger men than he. He was subject to bouts of depression. He was probably an alcoholic and drank too much. His son had been killed in an accident shortly before he became president, and that did not help the situation.
Franklin Pierce came into office in 1853 as somebody who was going to provide leadership. But what he really provided was an opportunity for the Southern political and economic establishment to still hold sway in Washington.
Right from the start, Pierce was strong-armed by Southern politicians into letting slavery expand west.
Jefferson Davis, who was Pierce's Secretary of War, came to Pierce one Sunday afternoon in May of 1854 and in effect browbeat him. A stronger president would have stood fast against that kind of pressure.
1854's Kansas-Nebraska Act let slavery spread into new territories. An uproar began, and events started to spiral out of control.
Pierce was weak, but everybody around him was all steamed up. The country was becoming infuriated, and Pierce really couldn't control it anymore. The country was headed for civil war.
Pierce is one of our bottom 5 presidents because he set the stage for national chaos, then did nothing to stop it. Just handed the mess over to another rudderless captain, the very worst on our list. He was a brilliant speaker, a constitutional scholar. Hope was high in 1857 he could hold the splintering Union together. That hope would be dashed by James Buchanan, a good man who lacked conviction when the nation needed it most.
Buchanan was over his head as president. He really had little support either in the House or the Senate. He basically built upon the policies of Franklin Pierce and really did little to even help us try to avoid a civil war.
Buchanan's first test as president was the Dred Scott case, when a slave sued for freedom. The Supreme Court ruled a slave couldn't be a U.S. citizen, and Buchanan sat idly by.
The Dred Scott decision was one of those events in the 1850s, along with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that sharply polarized the country.
Buchanan thought slavery morally wrong, but refused to take a political stand against it. As states began to leave the Union, he declared himself opposed, but said he had no power to stop them. All he could do was hand the nation's gravest crisis over to his successor, a railroad lawyer from Kentucky.
The hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in a period of moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. Dante said that.
Our top president had the courage to lead a frightened nation through its most terrible conflict. Abraham Lincoln kept the United States united.
Lincoln was voted the best president because he faced the greatest crisis this country has ever experienced. He preserved the nation, won the biggest war this country has ever fought, and brought an end to the institution of slavery, which had made a mockery of American professions of being a land of the free.
Lincoln's very first speech as president, his 1861 inaugural, was a bold appeal for unity. He told the South, "In your hands, not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war."
If Lincoln had not dealt with the crisis of secession and Civil War the way he did, we wouldn't be talking about a United States anymore.
The crisis erupted at Fort Sumter, Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, 1861. Under the control of Jefferson Davis, the newly created Confederate government demanded the fort be handed over to the South.
Lincoln really works hard to find some compromise, but he vowed that he was not going to fire the first shot.
Most Americans thought the clash would be brief. In fact, it would take 4 years and more than 600,000 lives. As fighting intensified, Lincoln came up with a bold strategy, a threat to strike at the Achilles heel of the South.
Lincoln had come to the point where he considered it necessary to strike against slavery as a means of weakening the Confederate economy.
It was really an attempt to try to undermine the black labor that the South had.
With a nation watching, Lincoln delivered an ultimatum, a speech that would be known as the Emancipation Proclamation. In fact, it was a last-ditch effort to get the South to return to the Union. But months came and went, and no states changed sides. And as 1863 began, Lincoln's monumental proclamation went into effect, freeing the slave workforce of the South and leading to the North's ultimate victory.
That was the single most dramatic and decisive presidential act of the Civil War, I think, was the Emancipation Proclamation.
After 4 bloody years, the Confederacy surrendered on April 11, 1865. 3 days later, the president and his wife took a well-deserved break to see the play Our American Cousin at Washington's Ford's Theater. In the end, what makes Lincoln our top president is that he confronted a crisis and acted on his convictions. He once said, "It's not the years in your life that count, it's the life in your years." And as his speech at Gettysburg reminds us, the dead shall not have died in vain.
Lincoln was able to distill the whole point down into this very memorable few phrases. And they live on. The government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. If you can write a sentence like that, you are going to be immortal.